Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are logging in from. Welcome to the Land Dialogue webinar series organized in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and Manga Bay. Thank you for joining us. My name is Latoya. I'm a journalist focused on covering Indigenous news, human rights, and conservation on a global scale. I'm delighted to be moderating today's session on navigating loss and damage, a path to justice for Indigenous peoples. The idea behind this webinar series is to raise awareness on the land rights of Indigenous peoples. These rights are a prerequisite to achieve national and international goals around forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. This is the fourth and final land dialogue this year. First, let me just go through some housekeeping rules. The webinar is mainly in English and Spanish, but we have simultaneous translations, also in French and Portuguese. To access the translations, you just need to go to the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, click on it, and select the language you want. The webinar will last 60 minutes. We have set aside about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Do use the chat box to let us know who you are, which organization you belong to, and where you are logging in from. Feel free to tweet using hashtag #LandDialogues, and you can follow the live tweeting from Land Portal and Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. Finally, we're also going to be recording today's session and we'll share the link later. Now that we've gotten that all out the way, let's turn to today's topic. The Loss and Damage Fund, established at COP28, represents a crucial step towards addressing the negative impacts of climate change for vulnerable regions and communities, especially for Indigenous peoples who are at the front lines of these impacts. These impacts include loss of crops and livelihood due to extreme droughts, damage to homes from rising sea levels, the destruction of heritage sites, and much more. So far, industrially developed countries have pledged a total of $731 million towards the fund, while one UN report estimates that 150 to 300 billion could be needed per year to address impacts. Today's webinar will explore the operationalization of the fund and examine its practical and conceptual implications for Indigenous peoples. We will delve into key questions, such as how funds will be raised, how the funds will be dispersed, and how the funds can best benefit Indigenous peoples affected by both economic and non-economic losses. We will unpack how to measure and address non-economic versus economic losses, including the destruction of culture and knowledge, and learn about approaches for advocating disaggregated data on the impacts of biodiversity loss. So let me introduce you to our speakers. In the interest of fairness, I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. We have Andrea Carmen. Andrea Carmen is the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. She's a Yaqui Nation citizen with over 3 decades of experience working with various United Nations institutions. Andrea currently represents Indigenous peoples on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Climate Crisis Commission and participates as the alternate for the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate on the advisory board of the UNFCCC Santiago Network. We also have Heather McGray with us. Heather McGray is the director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which makes grants that support women, youth, and Indigenous peoples to create and share their own solutions for climate resilience. She oversees all aspects of a $22 million global grant-making initiative that supports climate actions by women, youth, and Indigenous peoples. Heather also has spent more than 20 years in the nonprofit sector, working from local to global levels on climate change, community development, environmental governance, and education. We also have Janine Yazzie with us. Janine Yazzie is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the NDN Collective. She's an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. She has over 12 years of experience as a community organizer and human rights advocate, deeply rooted in local community issues. Beginning from her community in the Tsesiani in Dinebikeya, she has worked on the intersections of climate change, water security, food security, energy development, and nation building with Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations in the US, Canada, and Latin America. She has a background in international policy and human rights. Now that we have these introductions in order, Let's begin with the first question for our panelists. Climate change and development researchers say that, so far, pledges to the Loss and Damage Fund are too little to meet the needs of industrially developing countries. So far, countries have pledged $731 million to the fund, while some analysts say hundreds of billions more are needed. How much do you think should be raised, and what types of funds should be available? Can I turn to you, Andrea, to answer this question first?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. And thank you for all of the participants. I'm going to be sharing my screen and bring to the forefront the question and perspective for Indigenous peoples about loss and damage in general, and the attempt to put a price tag. And I know we talked about this in the Indigenous Caucus extensively at COP29 that just concluded in Baku. There's been a hesitancy to put a price tag because so many of the losses that we're experiencing can't be quantified monetarily. And I just want to show a couple of examples, and there are many, many examples. The first is what we're experiencing here in the Sonora Desert with the loss and the threats and the undermining of our traditional food systems. We are desert farmers as Indigenous peoples, the Yaqui Nation, along with others, our neighbors in the Sonora Desert. And just one example, this is a photo from actually from here at our house, our family farm, the Sonora Desert toad, that is quickly going extinct. And it's an essential part of our food system, even though we don't eat the toad. They come out with what's called the monsoon rains, the heavy rains that we ordinarily get towards the end of July, beginning of August, which is harvest season. So they eat the insects right at the time when it's most important, when our crops are coming to maturity and ready to be picked. But a few years ago, the rainfall began to change, either not come at all or come at a very different time. And this dramatically affects the life cycle of the toad. And we've noticed that there are hardly any anymore, where there used to be after the rains, literally hundreds jumping around. And this is a threat to our food systems. It's very difficult to see how that would be compensated for. The other slide is Shishmaref, Alaska, where, like many coastal Indigenous peoples communities, is falling into the ocean, or our island nations where the seawater is rising. And this is not only a threat economically, you can see it's going to take a lot of funding to move and reconstruct the homes, but it's a rights and identity issue. The right to self-determination is based on our being on our traditional lands. We're hearing the same from the small island developing states, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, others that are going to become refugees. And it doesn't matter what kind of multi-million-dollar home you might build them in New Zealand or Australia or wherever they're going to have to move to. They become refugees. They lose their self-determination as nations and peoples. And what is the compensation for that? What's the economic compensation? And just lastly, I want to conclude this point by saying that this was a statement we began to bring. I was a member of the facilitative working group at the time in its first 3 years of existence. We welcome Janine from our region, who will be taking that role for the next 3 years. But also our elders and knowledge holders, practitioners talked about the economic and non-economic threats to their knowledge systems and ways of life. And they say that no price can be put upon what they already lost, but direct funding could help us to preserve, protect, and restore what we've lost as much as possible. So I think Janine's going to talk more about those calls for direct access to funding, specifically for Indigenous peoples, to address some of the losses and damages that we are experiencing. So I will end with that and turn it over to the next respondent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And what you say is quite true, and I've encountered that quite a lot during our reporting as well, that there are so many elements within Indigenous peoples and communities that cannot be quantified, that you can't put a price tag on it. And that's exactly some of the elements that people do talk about when it comes to non-economic losses, which we'll dive into later, much more in depth. I will turn to you now, Janine, on if there is a price tag that exists. Before we kind of dive into what direct funding looks like, do you have a kind of an estimate of how much more funds should be raised and what types of funds should be available to Indigenous peoples?
Yes, this has been a core part of the conversation and many of the negotiations around climate finance in general. But in particular with loss and damage, when we're talking about both just devastating consequences of the lack of inaction, meaningful climate action, and the results of that, like a little of like what Andrea showed for us, as well as like the intangible losses that we can't quantify. Like there's no monetary value to compensate for some of the damages and impacts that lack of meaningful and effective climate action has on Indigenous peoples, nations, communities, lands, on ecosystem functions, and on the entire cycle of sacred life in the ways that we are interdependent upon one another. So what we have been really looking at is that instead of trying to create a quantity that can capture that, we don't want to convey that those losses can be wrapped into some dollar amount or some dollar quantity. It's important to compare what nations are putting forward in fossil fuel subsidies, in militarism, in extractive industries, to call for, at the very minimum, if those types of investments and financial resources are going to continue to flow to the very activities that are at the root of the climate crisis that we're dealing with, then they need to match those investments to also deal with the repercussions. And just by that criteria, the 731 million that you outlined is wholly insignificant. Especially since the few estimations that have been coming out have been in the billions per year as an annual estimate of what is needed to deal with the issues right now. And when you put on top of that issues of inflation that's affecting every country, as well as the compounding costs of cumulative impacts in communities, even the billions estimate is nowhere near where we need to be thinking long-term about the type of financial resources that need to go to this issue. And then to go to your second question about the design of the fund, I wanted to go ahead and share just a little bit of information about where my perspective is coming from as Director of Policy and Advocacy for Indian Collective, and the way that we show up bringing our model for an Indigenous designed and Indigenous led funding mechanism to these conversations. Because there's this assumption that Indigenous peoples in the so-called global North, because of where we are situated, and our proximity to like wealth and to countries that are at the core of a lot of these negotiations and hold a lot of power over determining climate finance, that proximity equates to access, but it doesn't. And so we've had to design and develop our own funding mechanism that can operate in a way that addresses the holistic approaches of Indigenous peoples and the challenges that we face when it comes to enacting our climate solutions. And so we move coming from a movement analysis and knowing that Indigenous rights Indigenous solutions, our activities to defend our homelands, and our ability to build the alternative models that are needed for climate resilience all go hand in hand. We take an interconnected approach to not just increase the resources and rematriate the resources that often have been stolen from an exploitation of Indigenous lands, territories, and resources, but we also bring those resources in a way that builds collective power and is centered around advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so a part of that is knowing that so many of the Indigenous climate solutions and climate challenges and the threats that we're facing in both economic and non-economic losses are tied to our land rights and whether or not those are enforced, resourced, and protected. And so we do a lot of our work around, this meta narrative of what land back means and getting lands back into Indigenous hands, but also exercising the self-determination to be the people that the land needs back in order to build resilience, to build healing, to restore our connection to our resources. And so when we talk about the funding mechanisms that are needed to do this work well, we are talking about ensuring direct access to Indigenous peoples in a way that minimizes the role of intermediaries, that centers the rights of Indigenous peoples, and that where possible is done through investing in Indigenous design and Indigenous-led funding mechanisms. And I'll go ahead and pause there.
Thank you, Janine, very much for that answer. I just wanted to highlight that important point you made on the discrepancy or the comparison between how much is put within subsidies that are for fossil fuels, or if we even tie it back to biodiversity, we know that there's $1.8 trillion that goes into either industries or initiatives that harm biodiversity, while we're comparing that to how much of a few $billion that is put into any kind of indigenous-led um, um, conservation program. So there is that discrepancy that we see across the board. Thank you for highlighting that, and also putting the attention on land rights discussion, given that we are in the land dialogue series. I'll turn to you now, Heather, for your thoughts, if you can share them.
Sure, thank you. And I really want to echo a lot of what we've already heard from my fellow panelists. So many important points about the pricelessness of a lot of what's being lost, and the real fundamentally flawed framing that comes from talking about the numbers and the scale. It's really about the nature of the loss and the quality of the loss and the who is experiencing loss, and the rights and sovereignty associated with that. I will speak briefly about the numbers for what it's worth, and honestly, it's a discouraging picture. Some of the audience may have followed the recent negotiations quite closely on climate finance at the UN, and others may be less aware. The parties to UNFCCC were only able to agree a goal of $300 billion a year for all climate finance, including loss and damage, including adaptation and mitigation. And this is a really paltry sum compared to the needs and compared to what's being spent on the fossil fuel industry, on the emissions that are harming people. Somewhat brighter light was a commitment made in that same decision to work toward a plan for generating $1.3 trillion per year. And this is more aligned with some of the estimates that are out there around the actual needs for climate finance. At the moment, there's not a call out specifically in these agreements for loss and damage finance, which is quite problematic. It doesn't enable the goal, the target for the global community to really encompass everything that's needed. And of course, the slower the global community is on finding the funding and the resources to solve these problems, the larger the price tag gets, and the larger the unpriced, the non-economic components of this grow. In terms of the structure of the fund, I think there's cause for a bit more optimism, actually. The board of the Loss and Damage Fund is meeting this week, and I was kind of intrigued by some of what's really rising to the top, and there's discussion and what's being put forward by the new executive director. There's really an emphasis on inclusivity in how they're thinking about the fund. And I think today is actually when they will talk about the role of non-governmental observers in the decision-making and the process of the fund's decision-making. So hopefully there will be a decision, and a positive one, that really provides for active observers on the board of the fund. Second, there's discussion around speed, of not letting this fund bog down the way most UN funds bog down and get very slow. And I actually think the creation of the fund, once it got started, has moved much more quickly than, say, the Green Climate Fund. And if you look back at the history of creating UN funds, this one is on a faster track. It's not on as fast a track as loss and damage is, and some of the crises that people are facing, obviously. But there's hope here that the speed is picking up and there's momentum. And then a thing that's, I think, super important and really quite powerful is there's a lot of discussion around small grants, and around small grants that would really leverage existing grant-making programs, including those run by Indigenous peoples. This isn't a simple thing to do at a United Nations fund. There's not a strong track record of getting money to the right places quickly and easily, but I think we're hearing good things on this front. I think we're hearing creativity, and I'm hopeful about the structure of this fund, even while how much money is in the fund and how much money really moves toward loss and damage is still a big question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heather, also for bringing in those technicalities to remind ourselves of the COP29 I just went through, and also the board meeting that's happening at the moment, and kind of giving a bit of a glimpse of what's going on within those discussions. Thank you. Janine, coming back to you again, you spoke about direct funding. And I know direct funding to Indigenous peoples has been a recurring demand at COP29 and at the COP and many COPs before this, also at the biodiversity COPs. From donor to recipients, can you explain a little bit more how you would like Indigenous peoples to have access to the funds, and any of the conditions or barriers that they tend to face along the way to access direct funding, of course?
Yeah, absolutely. As I shared earlier, Indian has been very diligently working on developing that very model to work across our program areas in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And in that capacity, have been participating in a working group that worked really hard with Indigenous peoples from across the 7 sociocultural regions of the globe to really sit down and analyze the barriers and challenges that were faced by Indigenous peoples on all fronts when it came to accessing the necessary resources to advance our solutions, our responses, to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, to avert the loss and damages that are threatening our peoples and our nations. And in that, developed this principles for direct access for Indigenous peoples. And I know my colleagues are sharing some of those links in the chat as well. Really, we were able to launch those direct access principles at Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. And since then have done a lot of work to get philanthropy, nation states, UN entities to adopt those principles as we continue to move forward, to incorporate those principles in all discussions and negotiations around climate finance and the way that those mechanisms need to be developed. And in that way, what we're advocating for is to ensure that these mechanisms that are being set up are accessible to Indigenous peoples, uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, can be utilized towards solutions and responses that are designed and prioritized by Indigenous peoples. And this becomes important because there are so many there are so many challenges still for Indigenous peoples, despite us being recognized for the ways that our traditional knowledge systems, the way that our traditional ecological practices, the way that even our language systems have all informed effective and meaningful climate action internationally. Like the recognition is there, and we're seeing a lot of movement in UN mechanisms to create more pathways to incorporate those responses and those strategies and solutions. And yet Indigenous peoples' rights continue to be under threat in across the globe in both so-called developed and developing nations. And so that's why we work to try to get more people to understand the role of these principles in all of our climate finance discussions and mechanisms, why we are calling philanthropy, states, and other partners in that are serious about addressing the severity of this climate crisis that we are all dealing with. And to do so in a way that is based off of proven practices and of existing models that show that centering these things is not only more effective in moving resources to where they need to be, but the impacts of moving resources efficiently to the people who are doing the work that needs to be done on the ground reverberates and has extenuating positive impacts on all peoples, on all ecosystems, and on Mother Earth. And so the reason why this becomes vitally important in this time is that we cannot have other people determine what funding priorities need to be. We also can't have other people determine what kind of finance comes down to Indigenous peoples, because we have experienced historically that some of these resources get moved in a way where the people who have contributed the least to climate change, but are still advancing the most efficient solutions, then become overburdened with debt and with other difficulties because of the structure of the finance that is developed. Or we have a lot of that finance, a lot of it taken off the top through intermediaries and through governments that become the primary recipients, and then who then control whether, and it's based on whether they recognize Indigenous peoples or not, whether Indigenous peoples actually have access to those resources. And so that's why we continue to push forward these principles to overcome those barriers and to ensure that resources are going to where they need to go that will have the best benefit for all peoples, ecosystems, and Mother Earth.
Thank you, Janine. And I just want to quickly follow up on a quick question. Can I ask your thoughts about how communities around the world who lack protection from their government or face state persecution, for example, we see this with Indigenous peoples in Myanmar's ongoing civil war, how do you think they could access funds?
Again, we're seeing a lot of these conflicts all throughout, some different nations. We're seeing it in Latin America. We're seeing it in Africa. We're seeing it in many parts in Asia, like you referenced, Myanmar. We're also seeing this in so-called developed nations, such as throughout the Arctic, where our Arctic Indigenous peoples, have rights that extend beyond colonial borders. We're also seeing these threats against Indigenous peoples in Canada and even in the United States and in New Zealand, where we're hard wins for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and land rights and treaty rights are now under threat because of domestic political values, of domestic conflicts, and just a whole range of reasons. And so this goes back to, again, the logic and the wisdom that was put into the development of the direct access principles accounts for this. And this is why we have language that's very clear in there to talk about how Indigenous people's self-determination for how they access access direct finance, or how they create direct access to finance, needs to be upheld. Because in places like Myanmar, what may be necessary there is that Indigenous peoples may need an intermediary of that they trust, that's picked and prioritized based on their own criteria for what it means to be in trusted relationship with an intermediary. Because what we know is that when there are domestic conflicts, there are threats against the very ability of Indigenous peoples to develop their own financial mechanisms. And this isn't a challenge that is limited to so-called developing nations, or to nations that may be struggling with civil conflict. We're seeing those types of laws being passed here in the United States with the new initiative to criminalize organizations and to give sweeping executive powers to the president and to the Internal Revenue Service. For those that are outside this country, our tax branch of our government, giving them sweeping authorities to take away nonprofit status if an organization is deemed, to be in support of terrorism. And this becomes significant because when Indigenous peoples' climate solutions also require us to fight for our land rights, to fight to protect our sacred places and our water systems from extractive industries, that fight can be labeled as a terroristic act at the will of a government. And so we are talking about conditions that are being set up in developed and so-called developing nations, where governments continue to exercise sweeping authority that can be used to criminalize Indigenous-led responses and solutions. And so this is why we need to center Indigenous self-determination and mechanisms when it comes to discussing what direct access looks like, especially where there are conflicts with nation states.
Thank you very much, Janine. That was a great answer, especially thank you for highlighting, the direct access principles that exist no matter what state of stability a country's in, especially in conflict zones, and also for highlighting the rise that we are seeing in terrorist or national security acts that are impacting communities and their access to funds and rights. I'll turn now to Andrea. Just like Heather said, meetings by the board are underway, and the funds for the loss and damage are set to be dispersed by 2025. How does any effective loss and damage fund properly respond to the non-economic losses Indigenous peoples face? For example, we see the loss of rituals and culture due to droughts impacting Indigenous totemic communities in Mexico. And is this distinction between non-economic and economic losses as clear-cut as being currently positioned?
Of course not. My first slide discussed that, but I wanted to bring up another aspect that was very disturbing that happened to add to the finance discussion and the source of finance. We also follow closely here for many years what's called the Article 6 discussion it's called international cooperation, but it's mainly focused on the carbon market and market-based so-called solutions. And this is just one example of what's being promoted. This is on our territories right on the other side of the Mexico border, the Sonora Desert. This is supposed to be an exploratory lithium mine. If you look at it, you think of exploratory as, them putting down maybe a little tube or something to see if there's lithium. This is one of the largest lithium deposits in the world, maybe the largest in the Sonora Desert. It's going to use the very fragile desert aquifer and contaminate, the estimates are, for at least 300 years, shipping it up to the United States in its processed form with an investment from the US that they've talked about of about $47 billion. And one of the very disturbing things that happened at COP29 is that market solutions or market generated finance was now looking at being included in these loss and damage funds. And the Indigenous peoples along with the small island developing states led by Tuvalu, strongly protested this, because what it means is that the developed countries are going to be off the hook if they can say, well, these funds can come from the market. And this is an example of a so-called market-based solution, so-called to climate change. Lithium, of course, makes Elon Musk rich. It is used for batteries for electric cars. And so I just wanted to put this in the mix as one of the things that is happening to diminish whatever actual contributions that so-called developed, industrialized countries are committing to put in. It's going to be offset by looking at funds from the carbon market, which are being coupled with the so-called biodiversity, creation of protected areas, and talking about principles. We've been able to work with the UN Environment Program to come up with principles for conservation funders and intermediaries. And again, the conservation movement has been now coupled with carbon offsets, forest offsets, carbon market projects to further displace Indigenous peoples in the name of conservation, in the name of green energy, in the name of just transition. So I don't want to leave this off the table as a major threat to Indigenous peoples on the ground, but also to those small countries and others like Indigenous peoples around the world that are hoping to benefit from a loss and damage fund. Now the market has been brought into it as well. Regarding what Indigenous peoples are actually doing on the ground. And I think it's very important, Janine mentioned this, as did Heather, that we're not waiting for funding from the United Nations or from the states that we live in, because our survival is on the line. So one thing that we are doing is to share and implement our expertise for knowledge about restoration of soil, healthy living soil that hasn't been depleted by agrochemicals or overgrazing of invasive species, like in our hemisphere, that would be cattle, for example. Mining, etc., is the third biggest absorber of greenhouse gases after the ocean and the atmosphere. Our water systems, as Janine mentioned, we're bringing back our traditional ways. This is our neighbors, the Tohono O'odham in the Sonora Desert, using original knowledge about clay-based irrigation systems based on just the rainwater that we get. These are some other examples, restoring our soil, restoring our water systems. The picture on the right is from the nation of Hawaii, and they took out 2,000 eucalyptus trees brought from Australia that use a lot of water. And within 6 months, our folks there, in nation of Hawaii, said that the hillside turned green, the water came back up, and they were able to plant taro. On the left, we have seed trading of drought-resistant seeds, bringing back our original seeds that are very drought-resistant in the desert and sharing them. And on the right, on the bottom, is restoring our original animals, like the buffalo, that don't tear up the roots like cattle do when they graze. They help restore the grasslands, and they're very climate resistant. So I just wanted to bring up some of these methods that we're already using now, independent of getting any funding, because our survival is at stake. This is a life and death struggle for Indigenous peoples. Of course, we need funding to support these efforts, to bring us together, to restore our lands, restore the health of our soil, bring our animals back. But we're doing it without funds now. So that's what we're contributing, and contributing this knowledge to the global discussion through bringing knowledge holders and practitioners into the international debates. We're willing to share with free, prior, informed consent, of course, as long as our rights are respected and our knowledge is respected. But these are things we're doing now already, right here, right now.
Thank you, Andrea, for those fascinating examples in your neighborhood and in Hawaii, and also for touching on the topic of averting and minimizing the negative impacts of climate change that lead to loss and damage before it even happens, which is a very important point. I'm going to turn to Heather now. Heather, I was wondering whether you could answer a question as someone who works with grants to Indigenous peoples and their climate resilience initiatives. So, what approaches should be taken to advocate for disaggregated data on economic and non-economic impacts? And why is this type of data important?
Thanks very much for this question. It's a little bit of a tricky one because data means so many different things to different people. And I have to say, at our fund, we haven't really thought so much about this in terms of data for a couple different reasons. One is just as background, we currently have a $6 million initiative specifically on non-economic loss and damage. And it's one of the first funding initiatives that's specifically targeting non-economic loss and damage. We're doing it in partnership with the Scottish government, who have been really important trendsetters and leaders on the loss and damage issue internationally. And we're using it with partners in the Pacific, in East Africa, and in the Bay of Bengal region of South Asia. All of these are places really on the front lines of the climate crisis in very different ways, given the kinds of changes happening. But what we're finding is that there's no bright line to be drawn between economic and non-economic loss and damage, first of all. And Andrea made this point really, really effectively at the start of this session. And so data we need to be careful with, because one of the things it could easily do is create a false dichotomy between these things. If we're gathering data that says this is the economic part and we're going to put a number on it, and this is the non-economic part and we're going to track other data, it's really not how people experience loss and damage in their real lives. In their real lives, the same loss can have a very significant economic impact while also being a cultural loss, a loss of heritage, a loss of tradition that is even more valuable than that significant economic loss. And then there's also a real dynamic between losses and, economic and non-economic losses. And sometimes these are heavily mediated by things like age and gender, where youth and elders have really different experiences of climate change, and women and girls have really different experiences of climate change than do men. So what we have been focusing on in our portfolio, and what we recommend to other funders, is that if you're going to focus on data, really look at gender. And we, by the way, are doing this in response to partners in the Pacific who have really requested it. They are really interested in being able to center women's voices in their work on loss and damage, and to be really clear around the gendered distinctions and commonalities amongst loss and damage needs and interventions and opportunities. And so we're focusing more and more on gender disaggregated data as one of the most useful things you can do as you think about what's needed in terms of action on loss and damage, and what's actually happening, who's being harmed, who's holding the losses, who's really addressing the damages. A gender lens is very helpful, and gender disaggregated data is powerful in so many other ways as well, beyond the loss and damage agenda, that this is what we recommend to funders.
Thank you, Heather, and for highlighting that it's the gendered component to look at. That's really, I'm pretty sure, interesting for policymakers and for others who are in the grant world to also look at. All right, now I have a final questions for all the panelists regarding the extreme weather that we experienced.
French interpreter is on the English channel.
Sorry?
The French interpreter was on the English channel, so I wanted you to repeat what you just said.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So no, I was just saying that thank you, Heather, for highlighting gender as an important component to look at for data. I think that's really important for also a lot of policymakers and others in the grant world when we're looking at what data points to look at when it comes to loss and damage. Finally, I'm going to go to our last question for the panelists, and it's regarding extreme weather events that happened this year. So, earlier this year in Latin America, we saw extreme flooding impacting many indigenous peoples, including the Ashaninka people in Peru who lost most of their crops. There were very few rapid response funding mechanisms available to these communities to address their impacts. So my question to the panelists, my final question, if they can answer quite quickly before we go to the Q&A, is it possible and relevant for the Loss and Damage Fund to be a mechanism that can rapidly deliver aid to communities? And what needs to happen in its design in order for it to be a rapid response fund as well? Andrea, could I come to you first for your thoughts?
Sure, yes, absolutely. I just wanted to highlight the possibility also along these lines of utilizing the Santiago Network, which was just operationalized at COP28, and a big gain in in our participation in general at the UNFCCC was that at Sharm el-Sheikh, Indigenous peoples, along with the gender and women constituency and the youth constituency, were afforded seats on the advisory board for operationalizing the Santiago Network. And myself and Gideon Sanango from Masai from Tanzania are the two representatives that were selected by the Indigenous Caucus to take those seats. I'm the alternate, he's the main rep, but we work as a team. And we've been able to achieve the recognition of Indigenous peoples' knowledge, and also having Indigenous peoples, aside from this whole developing false criteria, another false criteria, be able to offer expertise as well as ask for expertise. For example, Indigenous desert farmers here in Arizona can offer or receive expertise from Indigenous desert farmers in Africa, or the UAE, United Arab Emirates, have approached us because they have Indigenous desert farmers there. So we're able to offer each other expertise, and there is funding already available for Indigenous peoples to provide expertise to others and offer it even to states. Tuvalu has signed up to ask for expertise. So the important here, I think, is the Santiago Network uses the word averting and minimizing rather than compensating for things that have already been lost. So I think that's a very important aspect here that we should consider utilizing as well to support each other in actually preventing loss and damage. And it's the one mechanism that I see at the UNFCCC that accepts the role and that understands the expertise of Indigenous peoples, both as recipients and offering, and talks about averting, because I think with the loss and damage discussion, we've gotten away from the need to stop climate change, to reverse it. Rather than just thinking of, what minimal funds might be available that are never going to be enough to replace what Indigenous peoples have lost, our culture, our rights, our identity, our land, around, these things, our food systems. So that's my comment on that. And I just maybe end with a hopeful note along those lines. We are making some progress somewhere, even though, all of the states are pushing lithium mining, Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your thoughts. Can I turn to you now, Janine?
Yeah, absolutely. Just building off of Andrea's excellent answer, I think that that lays out why it is vitally important that we have and create mechanisms for rapid response funding. That is the primary way during a climate crisis to ensure that the most effective and efficient responses are receiving the resources they need to minimize damage and avert further damage from a climate crisis. Indian Collective, we're set up in that way because we know how emergent issues and challenges faced by Indigenous peoples deserve just as much attention and resourcing as their long-term solutions. And we've seen how this happens in real time. Like, for example, when this past year, when Lahaina in Hawaii experienced this devastating wildfire, something that we see all across our western coast and some parts of our eastern coast of the United States and of Canada. And when state mechanisms, our existing mechanisms, have such long processes, our philanthropy doesn't have a fund that is set up to respond to this already, or, and they have their own long processes, resources don't get moved right away to go to where Indigenous peoples need it the most, because they know the land, they know the vulnerabilities, and they know the best ways to respond to mitigate damage to their ecosystems, to their peoples, to their food systems, whatever may be in the pathway of a climate crisis. And when we are able to resource that, Indigenous peoples are able to respond in a way that builds strong mutual aid networks, that builds strong emergency response systems. And we've seen from the Lahaina fires and the fact that Indian Collective was set up to do rapid response funding, we were able to get resources there before any state or philanthropic organization was moving resources to those Indigenous peoples. And in many cases, especially we're talking about flooding in Africa, we're talking about landslides, forest fires in the Amazon. We're talking about these incredibly huge climate catastrophes that are threatening Indigenous peoples and other populations all around the globe. That type of rapid response resourcing becomes the difference between life and death. And so that type of response absolutely needs to be set up as a part of our way of averting and minimizing the impacts of loss and damage.
Thank you, Janine, and for raising the important example of what happened with the Lahaina fires, as well as what rapid response funding could do. I'm going to turn to you, Heather, to quickly also answer this question on rapid response funding.
Thanks. I think our experience shows as a funder, and I think the Lahaina example with Indian Collective also shows this, that if you want to move money quickly, there has to be trust. The funder has to trust the people who are receiving the funding. And if the trust is there, money can move really quickly and really effectively. And when it's not there, things start to get slow. This is a real challenge for funders, and particularly for international funders like the new Fund for Loss and Damage, because so many aspects of traditional philanthropy and international development finance and the international financial institutions, our laws that govern finance, all of these things are structurally embedding mistrust into the system. And they're really going to need to get dismantled if we want to address these losses and damage due to climate change. And particularly, we need to see more trust in Indigenous peoples, in their sovereignty, and in the mechanisms they've created to move money. There's been some improvement in this. There's been lots of conversation and slowly action within philanthropy, for example, of changing reporting requirements, changing grant timeframes, changing the ways that decisions get made and that applications get done. We've been in the midst of a lot of change ourselves at the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and a lot of experimentation with much more trust-based approaches to flowing funding and much more participatory and inclusive processes that, again, build trust and require trust. But for the larger funding environment, this is still a really big challenge. And on some level, we need to really dismantle a lot of systems and rebuild them with different lines of trust. And on another level, I find this hopeful myself, and I recommend this to other funders also. Trust is a choice we can make. We can just choose to trust, and really expand our circles of trust beyond the technical due diligence that funders usually use and the rules that we're starting to change, but we can move these a lot quicker. And this is just a prerequisite to moving the amounts of money and the speed that's needed, and then getting the money to the people who really do have the solutions, and who are often most on the margins, have the least time for all of this red tape that is supposedly making them trustworthy. We're making progress on this in philanthropy, and we can slowly see some of it changing in international spaces, but it needs to accelerate if we want this money to accelerate.
Thank you very much, Heather, also for highlighting, this question of trust and what happens, how that can be a barrier, and lack of trust can be a barrier to accessing funds rapidly. We do see this with, heavy bureaucracy, the due diligence requirements you just mentioned, a lot of laws, a lot of the reporting requirements. That is definitely a barrier that we have also realized. Well, I would like to thank all three of you for your time and answering our questions. Now we have to move to the next part of the event. We have only a few minutes for Q&A. I'll take a couple questions. And if you have any more questions, please use the Q&A box if possible. I'm addressing the audience here. And please identify yourself and the organization you belong to. So I'll go quickly to the first question I'll be choosing from here. I see a question here for Janine, if you have the time to answer this. So I'm going to read the script here. Dear Janine, my name is Marutua T. Surait from the San Mata Institute in Indonesia. 2 years ago, we discussed the loss and damage issues and the funding mechanism in the Southeast Asia and received very wary responses from the government. How can we access the draft principles on the direct funding mechanism for loss and damage that is being discussed? Best regards.
Yes, I put the link into the chat, but I'll repost it again. And just also wanted to piggyback off of another question about, the governance structure. And this is why we're very clear that in funding and direct principles also need to go in hand with funding Indigenous designed and Indigenous led funding mechanisms where it's possible, because the way that our values guide our actions as Indigenous peoples when it comes to resourcing climate solutions and responses is very different from the way a lot of institutions operate and govern themselves. And so to support the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, we also have to encourage the exercising of that self-determination and the development of our own mechanisms to receive funding and to make sure funding gets to where it needs to go. But I'll reshare that link.
Thank you very much, Janine, for answering that question. I'll now turn to a question for all the panelists. This person did not identify themselves, but what they say is, we are struggling with data centers and all their impacts, particularly theft of water. How do you tackle loss and damage funding or mitigation funding in ways that don't create an easy way out for polluters to get off the hook for designing better solutions in the first place that don't harm the natural world? If anyone wants to take that question.
Well, one thing that this brings to mind for me is the need for funding of much more holistic solution sets. We see silos in the funding space where loss and damage money can only be used for certain things, and other money can be used to push back on those data centers and the water theft. And we need to, as funders, reduce those silos and have more spaces where there can be integrated solutions to problems that are quite integrated and quite complex, and where you can get at that root cause of the loss of water. You have climate change as a component of that, right? But that is really exacerbated when your water is getting stolen by this massive economic force right now. And there's a whole advocacy agenda that has to get funded there as well of who's regulating those data centers, what rules do they need to comply with, how is it that they're able to steal steal water that people have used for other things for generations, and which the land needs now even more than ever, given the realities of climate change.
I think this is Andrea. The issue of water, maybe we need another whole webinar on that in relation to climate change. But as I mentioned, industrial agriculture produces 25% of the world's greenhouse gases, and along with highly unsustainable water use. Especially, I can speak for, here in Arizona, where we're restoring that sustainable water use in a desert ecosystem for growing food, but that's not what the industrialized agriculture, the groves of, trees and plants that don't belong in the desert is doing. And as a result, indigenous water rights are being threatened, even when they're included in treaties like, Janine and the Dene Navajo Nation, just basically lost a water rights case at the U.S. Supreme Court around these kinds of issues. So the issue of water and its tie into climate change and it's as a solution as well as a threat, I think needs further discussion. I know we don't have a lot of time for it here, but some of us are working in a very, not just a political advocacy, but a very practical way on those kinds of issues so we can communicate more.
Thank you,
Can I just
Andrea.
add real quickly?
Of course.
Just another component, and I see that people are having some issues opening up the direct access principles, but we do address this in the call for safeguards when it comes to the creation of these financial mechanisms and the sources of funding. This goes back to what Heather was talking about ensuring trust and transparency and actively building that. Indigenous peoples have known and have called for transparency regarding the sources of funding because we have had the experience of funding being siphoned and funneled from activities that violate national or international laws, Indigenous peoples' rights, and then go to a climate solution in someone else's backyard, our so-called climate solution. And as taking a holistic approach, a systems approach to this challenge that we are faced with, that is climate change, we cannot accept that type of trade-off mechanism. We know that our ecosystems are interconnected and our rights across the globe are fundamental. So human rights and Indigenous rights safeguards in the development of these funds is one of the ways that we're looking to prevent creating sources of funding that violate and endanger nature in one place, violating the human rights and Indigenous rights of one peoples while pretending to offset and to protect the rights of another.
Thank you very much, Janine, for sharing your thoughts on that question. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Actually, we're 4 minutes past the hour, and so we'll have to close the webinar. Thank you to everyone for staying with us. Apologies for not being able to take all the questions. There were quite a lot of good ones. I'd like to thank our speakers as well, Andrea, Janine, and Heather. Thank you so much for your time. Can everyone give them a virtual round of applause as you can in the chat box? And thank you to the audience as well for your participation. Of course, thanks also to our hosts, the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, Tenure Facility, and Manga Bay. It's been a real pleasure for me to moderate this event. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are.